Thank you very much for joining in this webinar on innovation and collaboration. And a big thank you to the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore for organizing this webinar. Today, we have three distinguished speakers. And before we begin, allow me to do a short introduction of this webinar and our speakers. So this year actually marks the 25th anniversary of the Singapore-Israel Industrial Research and Development Foundation. It has funded about more 190 projects since the start. And last week, we had a very successful Israel-Singapore Agri-Food Summit in Tel Aviv. And also just this month, the Enterprise Singapore actually led about a business mission of about 20 Singapore companies and agencies to Israel. So more than 25 years ago, there has been this active collaboration between the innovative countries of Singapore and Israel, and has continued to strengthen over the years. And of course, our collaboration actually begins since the founding of independent Singapore, since the start of independent Singapore. And in March this year, Singapore and Israel signed a Memorandum of Understanding on cross-border cooperation on artificial intelligence. And this year, we are glad to share that Singapore has also established its embassy in Tel Aviv. So for the webinar today, our speakers will speak about the theme of innovation and collaboration. Our first speaker is our chairman of the Middle East Institute at NUS, Mr. Bilahari, and who has spent a distinguished career at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he served in various positions in Singapore and also abroad. He was our ambassador to the Russian Federation, as well as our permanent representative to the UN in New York, as well as our permanent secretary of MFA. And he continues to write actively, and I also look forward to his insightful and incisive commentaries. He's our first speaker, and our second speaker is CEO of Thrive DX SaaS, Mr. Roy Zur. He's a cyber intelligence expert who actually has more than 15 years of experience in cybersecurity and intelligence operations. He was in the Israeli Defense Force, Unit 8200, and he retired. He left as a major, and since then he has continued to develop cyber education programs and technological solutions. He's also an active entrepreneur who is involved in innovation and collaborations. He will be our second speaker. And our final speaker will be Ambassador Khani. He's our Israeli ambassador to Singapore, and he has also had a very distinguished career in the foreign affairs. He was serving as his first posting in Beijing, and after that, he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Oslo. He has also had experience in Angola as the ambassador and non-resident ambassador to Mozambique. And subsequently, he returned back to Israel to serve as the Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Minister of Energy and Water Resources. He's also familiar with Asia. He actually served as Consul General to Singapore and Macau in 2013. And we are glad that he is currently serving in Singapore as the ambassador. So now, without further delay, may I invite our first speaker, Chairman Bilahari, to share with us his thoughts on innovation and collaboration.
Thank you, Edmund. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us in this webinar to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Singapore-Israel R&D Foundation. I'm going to be rather brief. None of you really came here to listen to me. And what I know about research and development and technology could be written on a postage stamp. For the young people who may have accidentally logged on, a stamp is a quaint old communications technology used in conjunction with an even older communications technology call a letter. In any case, the less I speak, the less chance of making a complete fool of myself. So if you have specific questions on innovation or technological collaboration, please direct them to the other members of the panel. Of course, I might still make a fool of myself. That's a habit I have. But perhaps the chance of that happening may be somewhat less if I stick to what I know and try to place this particular aspect of our relationship with Israel in a broader context. 3 years ago, in 2019, to celebrate 50 years of Singapore-Israel diplomatic relations, the Middle East Institute and the Israeli Embassy in Singapore launched a book aptly entitled Beating the Odds Together. And if I may be permitted a small plug for the book, it's well worth reading, so go buy a copy, please. Here it is, Now to Singapore-Israel relations. The vital help that the so-called Mexicans gave us in establishing the Singapore Armed Forces at a time when no other country would help us is well known. It was an act of faith in our future, without which we may not have had a future, and the foundation of the special relationship that exists between Singapore and Israel. That relationship has since broadened to include many other domains, and the organization whose 25th anniversary we are celebrating is one example of the multi-dimensional character of Singapore-Israel relations today. It would be boring and not particularly useful for me to list all the areas in which Singapore and Israel collaborate today. Instead, I want to reflect a bit on why Singapore and Israel have been such good partners. And I'm going to make two broad points. Firstly, 50 years ago, our geopolitical circumstances were broadly similar, although Israel's circumstances were certainly more complex, dangerous, and precarious. Today, our geopolitical circumstances remain complicated, but it is clear that Singapore and Israel are here to stay and are inescapably part of our respective regions. So I said our strategic environment remains complex, but the nature of the complexities confronting us have changed. The Abraham Accords are reshaping the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East in ways that some countries in Southeast Asia, indeed some Singaporeans, have still insufficiently appreciated and responded to. Southeast Asia, once considered the Balkans of Asia, is not without challenges, but today is by and large peaceful and prosperous. These happy changes were largely the result of global geopolitical shifts, but largely is not entirely. As crucial were the factor that Singapore and Israel hold in common, and without which we could not have navigated the geopolitical currents, navigated both in order to avoid treacherous reefs and shoals, and also to scoop up opportunities. We could not have navigated these geopolitical currents to bring us where we are today. And that common factor is the belief, it's the strong belief that small countries, however dire their circumstances, are never without agency. That belief is the fundamental reason why we beat the odds. Of course, whether you have the wit to recognize the opportunities and the courage and agility to seize them are different matters. But there is always something you can do to command your own fate. In both our countries, in different ways and for a variety of internal and external reasons, this fundamental and absolutely crucial belief is being challenged. Perhaps less so in Israel, but then here, but still challenged. But we should never forget that fatalism is fatal to small states. Second, we didn't just beat the odds, but we beat the odds together. And I want to reflect a bit on the complementarities between Singapore and Israel. The existence of complementarities implies the existence of differences. And of course, despite the similarities of geopolitical circumstances and the belief in our agency, there are differences between Singapore and Israel. I don't mean just the obvious differences. For example, as states, Singapore and Israel are much the same age. 74 years for Israel, 57 for Singapore, so we are in the same generation of states. But the Jewish nation is 3 millennia old, while the Singapore nation is still a work in progress. And of course, I don't mean the differences of interest that always exist even between the closest of partners. I mean a difference of mindset, a difference in the method and manner in which we have utilized the agency and collaborated, the agency without that even the smaller states are never without, to bring us where we are both today. And perhaps I can best illustrate what I mean by an anecdote. I was a frequent visitor to Israel before the pandemic upset all my travel routines. But now that travel is returning to normal, my Israeli friends be warned, I'm coming again. On a couple of my visits a few years ago, I encountered by chance university students from Singapore in Tel Aviv. They were there on an exchange program that gave them internships in Israeli startups. And all of you know that Israel epitomizes the creative and innovative startup nation that Singapore still aspires to become. Over drinks, I asked these students what they found most difficult about their experiences in Israeli startups and what they found most enjoyable. And their answers were remarkably consistent. As interns, they were given some problem or another to deal with by the boss of the startup. Being good Singaporeans, they invariably began by asking for instructions. And as invariably, the impatient response from their Israeli boss was, if I knew what to do, I don't need you, so don't bother me, go figure it out yourself. And if it doesn't work, go figure out something else. Being good Singaporeans, they initially found this very disconcerting. But being good Singaporeans, once they got over the initial shock, they rose to the challenge and found the experience liberating and enjoyable. This told me something about how Israelis and Singaporeans exercise agency. At the root of Israeli creativity is the willingness to take risks and deal with risks by bold improvisation. This is understandable given the environment in which Israel exists. When Israel makes mistakes, they are usually mistakes of action without adequate long-term planning. On the other hand, Singapore excels at long-term planning. But I fear that because of the very success of our long-term planning, our mistakes are usually those of excessive caution. We are moving into a global strategic environment of greater uncertainty, where not everything can be planned, not all plans will unfold as anticipated, and where the biggest risk is trying to avoid all risks. This is perhaps the most important thing Singapore can learn from our collaboration with Israel. And perhaps also Israel learn from collaboration with Singapore. Perhaps Israel needs to become a little more like Singapore, and Singapore a little more like Israel. Just a little bit. Now, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Chairman Bilahari. It was good hearing your thought-provoking comments. Now, our second speaker, Mr. Roy Zur, will share his views on innovation and collaboration from a perspective of a technopreneur.
Thank you, Edmund, and thanks, Chairman Bilahari. I think very interesting talk. Definitely didn't make a fool of yourself, and very enlightening. I think some of the things I wanted to cover also directly connect to what you discussed. So first, it's really a great honor to be here in this discussion, in a way also representing the Israeli side, the Israeli industry at least, as we have also a representative of the Israeli government and diplomatic side. It's always a great pleasure to be part of these events of Singapore and Israel relationship. Now that the skies are open again, I am more than excited to visit Singapore soon again after almost 2 years that I haven't been physically in Singapore. So I think as Chairman Bilahari mentioned, I think that it's important to see the differences and the similarities between the countries in the context of innovation. And I don't want to repeat some of the things that were mentioned here, but we know a lot of the similarities about small countries, in a region that, well, maybe Israel in a less stable region, but in regions that could be hostile or unstable from time to time over the years. Fairly young countries, regardless of the history of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation as a country, Israel is still fairly young. Singapore is a bit younger, but if we compare this to other nations globally, we are talking about fairly young countries. And also the fact that both countries are, in its essence, in the region, in the physical space, have not a lot of significant natural resources. There are, of course, access to the. Singapore has great access to the trade routes, etc. And Israel has its own advantages. But if you think about other countries with significant natural resources, whether it's oil or other physical resources, both countries are not known for this. And for countries like small and young and with lack of resources and in hostile environment, in sometimes at least, we understand that it needs to be something else to allow these countries and these nations to prosper and to succeed in their growth and their long-term mission. And that actually directly connects to the concept of innovation and ingenuity. Because when you think about the main resource that both countries, both nations have, we are talking about the human resource. This is the main resource that both countries have. And the fact that both countries were based their growth and prosper on human achievements, on education and on science and on innovation and ingenuity. And this is, in a way, also what we celebrate today, this partnership, because this partnership and the concept of this joint collaboration is around innovation in research and development between Singapore and Israel. This is in the words of this collaboration, right? So it's amazing that in this 25 years, so many new opportunities was created, new products, new technologies. Some were purely focused on research, but most of them were also implemented on a customer scale. So also created change in the market. It's not just for research, for the sake of research, but it's research for the sake of getting our lives better, whether it's in different fields of science and education and technology. And we created together new products and new markets. And that's also what we are celebrating today. And we also shortened the time, right, to bring this new innovations and enhanced products and enhanced technologies into the market. So maybe some things, instead of taking much longer, the fact that both nations and teams from both countries collaborated allowed us to achieve what we achieved in a shorter period of time. And again, eventually to contribute to the greater good and to the success of society, of science, of education, etc. And as Mr. Chairman said, there are also some significant differences, right, between the countries. Singapore, in many ways, is more methodical, process-oriented, obsessed with quality, cautious, sometimes maybe too cautious, but in many cases, cautious is necessary. While the Israeli side, and again, of course, it's a stereotypical thing. There are some in Singapore and some in Israel that do not follow the stereotype, but in general, the Israeli side is a bit more chaotic, risk-taking, maybe sometimes without thinking about the consequences. Sometimes it allows us to be a bit more creative and very much results-driven. And I also like the example about the experience of interns in Israeli startup. And as also as an entrepreneur and a CEO of a startup, I'll mention this with hundreds of people today in our company. I think it reflects very well what the chairman said, very well of the cultural concept. And I think in a way it also starts in the military. and I'll address this in a few minutes, but just as from my experience, when you're even a young soldier in Israel, it's very, you're being encouraged to express your opinion, to disagree, to provoke in a way sometimes the discussion, the argument. And in some ways, I found myself, even as a young officer in the Israeli army, I served there for about 10 years, but as a young officer, for example, when the unit needed to send someone for a discussion in the United States, in DC, with senior officials from other security and intelligence agency of the US, they sent me, a 20-year-old. And I was not a unique case, because I was the one that was actually involved in doing doing the work. So it makes sense to send me. And I think that in Israel, it's much less about hierarchy and the formal structure and the rules, less about rules and more about guidelines in general. We are not really good with rules in Israel. They're really good with guidelines, and we find our rules within these guidelines. And I think the difference here is not what we celebrate, is not the difference and also not the similarities, but we're celebrating the complementing side of it. We're celebrating exactly how, when both nations collaborate and where teams from both countries collaborate, they can achieve what they can achieve. Because in some ways, and I really liked what Mr. Chairman said about, in a way, Israel maybe needs to be a bit more like Singapore, and Singapore a bit more like Israel, is that exactly when you create this collaboration between the two teams, or teams from the two countries and two nations, you find exactly the whole that is bigger or greater than the sum of its parts. The Singapore side brings the process, the method, the focus on quality, sometimes the risk averse and the focus on cautious. The Israeli side brings maybe the more chaotic side, the results driven, the less about focusing on the rules and finding ways to get things done. And then together we achieve something that is greater. And this is also the reason when I started my last company, Cybint. I had a few companies in my entrepreneurial experience, but my last company, Cybint, that was recently also acquired and joined forces with another company, I'll mention it soon. I actually established a company in Singapore. I registered the company in Singapore. Not at first. At first, it was an Israeli company. And we had some customers. The concept of the company, when I decided to start it, so in my military experience, one of the things I did in the cybersecurity and cyber intelligence unit, Unit 8200, one of my main responsibilities there was focusing on taking cadets from high schools in Israel and reskilling them into cyber intelligence, into cybersecurity in a matter of 3 to 6 months, because the mandatory service in Israel is fairly short, is 2 to 3 years, it depends on specific positions. And in the military, we had to take people from high school, because that's the compulsory service. That's how it works. And in a matter of a few months, make them ready to work for a leading cyber intelligence and cybersecurity unit, right? So how do you do this without sending someone to university for years of degree? You have to find ways to accelerate their education. So this is what I did in the military. And then when in the industry, I thought, why not replicating this concept and replicating this model to the industry? And that's when I started my this company called Cybint under the concept of cyber intelligence, Cybint. The idea was that we'll create these solutions that can take people from the industry with no significant experience or no experience at all, and make them either cyber savvy or even cybersecurity professionals in a short period of time. I started a company in Israel, and we started to have customers in different places. And then I was invited to Singapore. It was 2019 or late 2018 by NTUC Learning Hub to a conference. And one of the interesting, I think it was in 2019, and one of the interesting parts back then, I mean, I visited Singapore once back then, but not for business. And I was not very familiar with the Singapore culture and work culture and business culture. And when I was invited there to a conference at the NTUC Learning Hub auditorium there, and I presented to a very large group of people, and I saw the hunger for knowledge, and I saw the love for education of the people there. And I think that, and again, I'm talking as a foreigner, right? I'm not a Singaporean, but looking from the outside into Singapore, I saw a country that understand the value of education, that really see the value of education and high quality education and skills. And in a way, starting a company that is in the intersection of cybersecurity and education. I thought, well, this is actually a place that understand the value of innovation in education as well. Not just because sometimes people think about education as something that is a bit, more traditional, but there are innovations in education as well. And after this conference, with NTUC Learning Hub, which also back afterwards signed and became our first partner in Singapore, and we are still, by the way, partnering. And together with NTUC Learning Hub, I think we trained more than 10,000 people in Singapore. I don't have the exact numbers, but more than 10,000 people for sure. And that's amazing, by the way. And NTUC Learning Hub connected us also to some of their counterparts and peers in the government, organizations like IMDA, organizations like IBF. And then I also learned that about the support of the Singapore government and government entities and NGOs as well in education. The government was actually funding and sponsoring. I know it's for you, it sounds trivial, but it's not. Because I'm also working in many other countries around the world and in the US, and it's not that trivial. The country, the government understand the value of education and sponsor education and provide the means and the ability to do this. And that, by the way, this is also a very strong accelerator for innovation. And I was surprised to find the support of these organizations. And we got the support of IMDA, including sponsoring and funding students, and IBF, including sponsoring financial institutions and financial professionals. And then I was introduced also to the industry, and I met some officials at UOB, United Overseas Bank, and they were also excited about education. And then I found out that not only NTUC Learning Hub and IMDA and IBF, but also large enterprise from Singapore are also very excited about innovation in education. And that was for me a very interesting experience learning about Singapore. And after a few meetings in Singapore, I said, I have to actually establish my company in Singapore. It makes a lot of sense for me to actually register the company there. And I started a process, and with one of my colleagues back then, who was an Israeli general retired, Udi Shani, who was the former head of C4I, also the chief director of the Israeli Defense Ministry at some point. He introduced me to some Singaporean officials, and I met a person. His name is Mr. Tan T. Hao. He was also the permanent secretary of the National Development and the Ministry of Home Affairs and others, and commissioner of the Inland Revenue of Singapore. And back then, he until now also represented like a fund that decided to invest in my company. So I raised money in Singapore. And so my entire experience with Singapore was an amazing experience. So in a way, I would say that without Singapore and without the Singaporean support from the industry, from the government, from investors, I couldn't bring my company to where it is today. And the company today, what was Cybint and now what is part of Thrive DX, is already globally almost 2,000 people, focusing on reskilling the workforce, upskilling the industry, establishing partnership with universities around the world, with enterprise around the world. But for me, the journey started in Singapore. Because Singapore was the first to believe in this mission. And for this, I'm forever grateful, of course. And also that's why I'm so excited when I'm invited to these events, and that we are celebrating Singapore-Israel relationship. And when I saw the invitation to this one, I actually looked at my small library. Fortunately, I don't have a big one. Most of the books are digital, but I found a book that in my second visit to Singapore, and I actually have it here with me, the book that I was given about hard truths. I know it's like it's flipping it because of the mirror image, but and I think that I have to say I haven't read all of it, but I read a few chapters of it, and in a way, I've learned a lot about kind of like the idea behind Singapore, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but today, I believe you are aware of it, but maybe I will emphasize this today. The Singapore is more than a country, is a concept as well. So in Israel, our current prime minister, Naftali Bennett, he actually, before he was elected, and I'm not getting into the complex political situation in Israel, but before he was elected or before he assumed this position, then he actually called his entire financial plan, economic plan to Israel, the Singapore Plan. That's the name, the Singapore Plan. And the idea behind that is how we, Israel, can become more like Singapore in different aspects. And today it's not, it's a known fact that Singapore is actually leading in many aspects, and actually Israel in some ways is behind. So I think that it depends on what, but definitely in science and quality of education, I think Singapore is definitely the top. And I think that this is also an opportunity for us as Israelis to learn from Singapore. And this is exactly where it's complementing. In a way, Israel supported Singapore in its first years, and Singapore is still supporting Israel as well through the years. And I think now maybe is the time, when we also learn a lot from Singapore. And a few things, kind of like to finalize to summarize my part, is that, as I said, because my company is focusing on cybersecurity and education, also in the context of Singapore, a lot of the collaboration with Singapore today is around cybersecurity. And I think if we go back to the history of Israel and Singapore and the collaboration around defense and the military collaboration as well, in a way, when we think about how the world evolved and also the warfare, I think the cyber warfare evolves, we understand that now the two countries, the two nations are also collaborating in this new space, the cyberspace. So it's not just the sea, the land, the air, but also the cyberspace. And in this cyberspace, as a company that represents cybersecurity education and cybersecurity innovation, we see that Singapore understands it. And that Singapore understands that the cyberspace is another field in which we have to be superior to our adversaries, whether they are criminals or government-led organizations or even terror organizations, because it's the basis for economic stability, it's the basic for political stability, it's the basis for saving people's lives and infrastructure and critical infrastructure. And for that, I have to say, from working with many different countries today, my company, North America, Europe, different parts of Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia. In that case, I believe that Singapore, its industry and its government, leading at least in the level of understanding the problem and the necessity to solve this problem together. And I'm sure also that this collaboration, the Singapore-Israel innovation and R&D collaboration, should and will also support cybersecurity innovation and defense innovation, because this is a critical part of keeping our country safe and also a critical part of innovation and research and development. So I think that's I didn't have a planned speech, but I kind of like thought about sharing my my thoughts. So these are my thoughts about the collaboration, and of course later in this session I'm happy to address any questions around that. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Roy. It's a pleasure to listen to your engaging experiences about innovation and collaboration from the military and private sectors. So like what Roy mentioned, he welcomes questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to type your questions and address it to MEI events, and we'll be able to answer them subsequently. And finally, we have Ambassador Khani, who will share with us his experiences as a diplomat in terms of innovation and collaboration. Ambassador, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. Good morning in Israel. Good afternoon in Singapore. I'm actually on leave, so I join you from the south of Israel at the moment, from a small village where I grew up. So it's nice to be connected to Singapore this way until I come back from my vacation. Indeed, we're celebrating 25 years for CIRD, for our bilateral industrial R&D fund that was started operation in 1997. If I wanted to put sort of a headline to my remarks, I would try to do something from startup nation to unicorn nation to centaur nation, and I will get back to it in a few minutes, because I think it's important to our techies and economists, and of course also for us in the diplomatic service, when we have to do our part. Now, the fund started at 1997. It was only 4 years since the government of Israel started what we call at the time Yozma. It was Yozma means initiative in Hebrew, and that was the government program for high-tech greenhouses. And we started in 1993 because there was a need. There was a need to help the industry, the tech industry, and it was also, mind you, a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we had a lot of people who came from the Soviet Union to Israel with technical skills, with scientific skills, and there were not enough jobs for them. So we needed to find a way how to employ them and use their talents. Now, I was looking this morning for the definition of the OECD for innovation. And I read, an innovation is the implementation of a new or significantly improved product, good or service, or process, a new marketing method, or a new organizational method in business practices, workplace organization, or external relations. So there is even something for Bilhari and myself when they managed to include external relations. So even ambassadors can feel a little bit comfortable when talking about innovation. But to me, the emphasis should be technology. We're talking about innovation in technology, because there could be a lot of innovation. Anyone who is starting, whatever, a noodle stall is innovating in one way or another, taking initiative. So as I said, there was a need for government involvement. And in Israel, we follow a little bit what we had already with the US. We had a fund with the US. We have two funds with the US. One was called BIRD, the other one BSF. But from BIRD, we came to the idea of having CIRD for a bilateral fund that will support joint research in industrial R&D. With the US, we have also BSF. That's more academic cooperation. Now, investment in R&D, there is so much you can say about it, and there's I think everybody understands the importance of it. I just want to say, to allude to an interesting fact in Israel that I think some people are not aware of it. If you look at the published data, you see that Israel is still investing 4.5 to 4.8% of GDP in civilian R&D. Okay, I'm talking just civilian, not talking about defense R&D. And this is probably the highest percentage in the OECD. But it's important to know that by today, and I mentioned 1993, but today, and it goes for several years now, most of the investment is private, is not government investment. And most of the investment is foreign, in fact. This is where we come as a foreign service trying to encourage venture capital to flow in Israel. And I was involved with that along the years quite a lot. And why is that? Because there is so much demand for investment in Israel, and therefore we as a government don't have to invest the amount that we used to invest in the 90s, and we can use the money for other practices. I mentioned Startup Nation, I mentioned Unicorn Nation. It's known that there is many tech unicorns in Israel. I think the current figure of last year, 2021, was 49 unicorns. Unicorns meaning a company with a valuation of over $1 billion US. And 49 unicorns, tech unicorns, is in Israel is more than all of Europe put together. Sounds strange, but it's a fact. The interesting fact is that the COVID years, we're out of COVID. I mean, it's still with us, but we know how to live with it by now. But COVID-19 proved that actually it was not that a bad thing for the tech industry in small countries. In tech, it was demonstrated that you can be global everywhere and from everywhere, and people could run the businesses from the kitchen table the same way we do it by Zoom. So a lot of things changed, and we have seen, in fact, that the year 2020 was a record year in terms of venture capital investment in Israel, and 2021 was even better. So when the entire global economy was suffering, I mean, the rich people didn't suffer, of course, but the economy as a whole suffered. Actually, the tech industry in Israel was booming and was going from strength to strength. So this is something to bear in mind. And here I want to come back to Unicorn and Centaur Nation. I think what we have seen in the last several years is not without risk. And with the increase of interest rate, I think investors already changing their taste, and unicorn is not enough, and investors would like to see companies not just valuation based on hope and image, etc., but also based on the revenues and income. And we in Israel, being a small country, have to understand that venture capital is like a cloud. It's hovering above. I mentioned most of the investment is coming from abroad, and the cloud can be shifted away with the wind. So this is a risk we have to bear in mind, and we have to find the ways to be creative and constantly creative in order to offer enough deal flows and enough innovation for the investment to come in and to grow into businesses. So this is, I'm not going to say this is a warning, but this is something that we have to be aware of. Now I want to say a few things about culture and society. It was mentioned before by the two previous speakers, by my friend Bilhari and by Roy as well. And to me, and this is my take of what are some of the characteristics of the Israeli society, of Israelis that are conducive for innovation. One thing is that risk-taking, or at least not being risk-averted. This is, I think, one of the strong characteristics of the Israeli society and the Israelis. Second is think global. Being a small place, in Israel is a small country with a small market, I time and again see that the entrepreneurs, the tech entrepreneurs, they don't think of making it big in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem. They think of making it big in Silicon Valley, in New York, in Boston, in China, in Europe, in Germany, or in the UK. So this is very important, and I see it is already within the culture of the Israelis thinking globally. Third, of course, it's being bold, or as the Hebrew word chutzpah means, and it involves with challenging of authority. And we are very good in challenging of authority, and you could see it everywhere in all sectors and all levels. But it also goes with some problematic aspects to it. So this is not something that I think that I would recommend to adopt by other nations. And I don't think it's something that it is easy to adopt because it's got to do with the culture. So I'm just saying, what I see among my people. Another element which I think I see among my Israeli friends is that people have a sense of purpose. This is something I don't see in many other Western countries among young people. Israelis have a sense of purpose. This got to do with our history and with our geostrategic challenges. Geostrategic challenges is a code name for being surrounded by enemies for many years. Another element is, of course, necessity. Necessity and the necessity with severe challenges require to find solutions. If everything is delivered to the table, there's no need to find a solution. If life is very, very comfortable, there's no necessity to develop new solution. And of course, another element, that this is something that one cannot overlook, is sound and advanced defense industries. The Israeli rather robust defense industries are a constant source for innovation that spill over into the civilian sphere. Now, we are less good at long-term planning, but as we celebrated the holiday of Shavuot, and Shavuot last week was the holiday that we commemorate the receiving of the Torah. It is known that the Israelites, upon receiving the Torah, said in Hebrew, "Na'aseh v'nishma," meaning we'll do and we'll listen. This is very odd because usually you should listen and then you do, but the Israelite already thousands of years ago said, we'll do and we'll listen. First we do, then we'll listen. It's stuck to our culture and there's no way to get rid of it. Now, the last point I'd like to make is about Israel and Singapore. Billy Ari spoke about it in a much more eloquent way that I can repeat. So I'm just going to say a few things, few short remarks. I think that due to the joint history of our special, and I would rather I can say intimate relation between our countries and some similarities, the level of trust between the two governments is very high. And that allows setting up the fund in 1997, and it continued to allow very close cooperation. You look what kind of cooperation countries have, and you will see that the level of trust dictates the level of cooperation. And there is no way to separate those two things. If you want to have a very strong scientific and research cooperation, you need to have a very high level of trust. And this is something that has been built over the years, and I think we all enjoy it now. For the fund itself, for third, we've seen now a new momentum to the fund, and this new momentum started about 3 years ago. One element is a new focus. I suggested to the fund, to the board of the fund, to do a rethinking and to refocus, and to choose 2 to 3, 4 maybe subject of focus for joint project, because I've seen in the embassy that the number of application was dwindling down, and I felt that that we lost momentum after more than 2 decades. I'm very happy that the board on both sides agreed to my suggestion, and we have now a focus. One of them was mentioned by Edmund before, was the conference last week in Tel Aviv that was focused on food tech and agri-tech. This is one of the focal point of the fund for the years to come. Another change in the fund was increase in the size of the grants, and the third was the increase in the percentage of support for every project. That was, I think, necessary in order to make the fund more attractive to researchers and to industrialists. And I'm happy to say that this is a good example. Not too many examples, but this is a good example that sometimes even governments do good things. As both countries now, let me say something like that. Both countries, Singapore and Israel, will most likely remain small countries, small nations. And therefore, we both separately must punch way above our weight in order to progress. It is clear to me that if we don't punch above our weight, we will just slide back because of the very, very severe global competition. The competition is fierce, and we need to keep on doing extra bold effort. And one major way to do so is through tech innovation. We simply don't have the sheer size in Israel, I think also in Singapore, the sheer size and the number just to lay back and count on our steady growth based on our local market. It's just not going to work. It never worked, and we have to be bold, aggressive, and global. There's no other way. And tech innovation and tech implementation is a very, very important element of how to go there. And looking from what I see as an ambassador in the past almost 3 years, I see that the more good things coming our way, and I wish the next 25 years to be even much better. And I think there is a good reason to believe that this will be the case. And by that, I just want to thank you all participants to joining us today. And many thanks to MEI, its dedicated staff, to you, Edmond, and of course to the energetic chairman, my friend Bilahari. So thank you all. And here I'm just going to repeat what Bilahari said. If you have any tech-specific question, please don't ask me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kani. We appreciate your very perceptive comments about Israel, the characteristics, as well as the developments to keep a lookout for. And thank you also for implementing measures to improve the use of the funds for the foundation. So thank you. Now we have time for questions, and we would like to invite our participants to type your questions into the chat box. You can address it to MEI events. We already have some questions, right? So firstly, one question this is open to all our speakers, all three of our speakers. Is related to the geopolitical situation about how there is friction between US and China and a possible digital decoupling. How do you foresee that impacting Singapore and Israel? Maybe we'll have Chairman Bilhari start the ball rolling first with your views about the challenges between China and US and leading possibly to a decoupling and how it's going to impact both countries. Sorry, yeah, Chairman, we need to.
Okay, I'll give it a shot, at least the first go. By the way, Roy, Udi Shani is a good friend of mine. Give him my regards and tell him I'll be around.
I will.
Okay.
I will.
Yeah.
Udi's great.
Yeah. Look, you know, somewhere maybe 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, if you are in the same business as Sagi and me, and you read all the usual journals, I found a very strange thing. You know, people, commentators, academics were talking about the return of great power politics. And I was very puzzled because who the hell said it ever went away in the first place? You know, we went through a very short and historically anomalous period, say between the end of the Cold War or the end of the Soviet Union, 1991, and the beginning of the global financial crisis, when there seemed to be only one dominant power, one dominant system, and as some silly academic put it, the end of history. Well, history is back with a vengeance. In fact, it never went away. Great power competition is a fact of international relations. And small countries like Israel and Singapore just have to learn to live with it. It is no different in principle from what we have had to live with for centuries, even before there was a Israel, before there was a Singapore, right? But there is one characteristic of US-China competition that is new in history. You know, it's become very common to talk about US-China competition as a new Cold War. This is a very silly and stupid analogy. The Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union was competition between two different systems. The US and China, by contrast, are vital and irreplaceable parts of a single system. And they are connected to each other and the rest of us, to Singapore, to Israel, to Europe, to every country in the world, by supply chains of a scope, of a density, of a complexity never before seen in human history. And this is what distinguishes 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence. Now, I think it's very unlikely that given the complexity, given the scope of these supply chains, it's very, very unlikely that they can bifurcate into two completely different systems. Again, not at any cost that either of the two principles are willing to bear, whether they know it or not. Now, there will be bifurcation in some specific domains, and some of those domains will be technological domains. In fact, you already see it happen. But I'll give you but I don't think, you know, the internet, for example, is largely bifurcated. But largely is not entirely. And there will be further bifurcation, particularly in technological domains with national security implications. But I don't think even there it is going to bifurcate entirely. Let me give you just one example. We all know now that supply chain, that semiconductors are a serious Chinese vulnerability. Semiconductors at the high end of are very serious Chinese vulnerability. And it's going to be very difficult for them to address that vulnerability because all the most crucial parts of the semiconductor supply chain, and it's one of the most complex supply chains, are held by the United States and its allies and its partners and its friends like Taiwan. All right. On the other hand, China is 40% of the global semiconductor market, and you cannot possibly cut your own companies, the companies of your allies, your friends, your partners from 40% of the market without doing them serious damage. And that's a very different kind of competition. It's not, right? And it's a more complicated kind of competition. Now, it's going to make life more complicated for countries like Israel and Singapore, which are part of this global system. But in complexity, there is agency. We should not forget that. The complexity creates possibilities. The simple binary competition between the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and the US was not really very complicated. It was very dangerous, but it was not very complicated. And the choices were binary, it's A or B. Even like Singapore, when you pretended to be non-aligned, we knew which side we were on. But in this new competition within a single system, it's more complicated. It's going to cause more headaches for us, but it also creates more possibilities. It gives agency to us. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Chairman Bilahari, for your very pragmatic, at the same time hopeful perspective on.
I'm never hopeful, I'm just realistic.
Realistic, okay. But in a way, the possibilities, I think, will be beneficial for both Singapore and Israel.
If we have the brains to see them and the courage to take them.
Yes, indeed. And Ambassador Khani, would you like to share your views?
Well, on the wall behind me, you could see there is a photo of me many years ago in the 90s riding a tricycle in the Forbidden City in Beijing. I ride different bicycle these days, but I learned then that one should never underestimate China and the ability of China to move forward and acquire more and more capabilities. So I believe at the end of the day, China will be able to find solution to its tech weaknesses. But I also know, and this is something I think everybody knows, that the United States is Israel's closest allies and about to remain so for years to come. And as Ambassador Bilahari said, I found it also, I agree with him totally, I found it very unlikely that we're going to see a total technological decoupling. It just doesn't make sense. The cost is enormous. So we'll see separate systems. Some separate system already exist. We'll see more of that. But I also don't think that this is the wish of the two superpowers, China and the US, to drive into a total decoupling. I think both can lose from that, and both have much to gain from keep on trading and working together wherever is possible. And I think it was said by the two superpowers themselves. I don't have to guess here. Well, of course, you asked what happens. We'll have to live with this situation. I mean, Israel is a small country. We know that we're a small country, and we have to be agile, flexible, sometimes smart, and sometimes we just have to improvise. But I think there is a potential that it will be more complicated to countries in Southeast Asia. It will be more complicated to navigate than it will be for Israel, when it's clear to all involved that for Israel, the US is its closest allies for so many reasons.
Thank you, Ambassador Khani, for sharing your views. Earlier this afternoon, I had a discussion with an Israeli cybersecurity company that was invested by Temasek. And interestingly, they have a cloud-based cybersecurity solution for AWS, and now they're developing, in the process of launching one for the China cloud-based users. So on this note about technology, I think it's timely that we have Roy share his views about digital decoupling and his thoughts on the impact on US and the impact on Israel and Singapore. Over to you, Roy.
Yeah, I think, look, from the industry perspective, at least, and because we are specifically, in a way, I'm representing a cybersecurity company. Of course, there are challenges in the. If I'm going back to the question about the challenges of U.S. China, okay, first, just to address this, I think that it is a challenge. You know, it is a challenge because when we work with sensitive aspects in innovation and technology like cybersecurity, and it directly connects to aspects of national defense and international defense, then it's very difficult to be neutral because none of the sides is necessarily accepting you as neutral. And even if it's not, I'm not representing anything political or government oriented, but even the markets, the financial markets in the US may react in some aspects to things you do with their non-allies in a negative way, and vice versa. And I think that at least the solution that we found as ThriveDX is first that we focus only on defense aspects, and we are not doing anything offensive in cybersecurity. And at least that in a way allows us to be a bit less or a bit more neutral in a way, because we are not helping anyone to attack anyone, and we are not teaching anyone how to attack anyone. We are not focusing on causing any damage, but we focus on protecting mostly industries, critical infrastructure, etc., from each other's attacks. So in a way, maybe at least that's what we tell ourselves, that we actually contribute to the stability. But there are still complexities there. So that's for my comment on that aspect. And I don't know if there was another part for the question that I missed, but
okay, thank you, Roy. I think you answered the question. There was this question about how do we get talents, right? Because talents is scarce for both cybersecurity and also for foreign service. So this question, we'd like to open it to all three of our speakers. In your views, in this age where we have a shortage of talents, how best can we attract talents to both foreign service as well as cybersecurity? Maybe Roy can continue, and then
maybe I'll start from the industry. I would not talk about how to attract talent to government or national service, and just because it's not my field of expertise. But I would say that from the industry perspective, there are a lot of different things to say, but I will focus just on one thing. You know, if I had to choose one thing, and in the US, it's I would say the definition is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can just use the word diversity. And I think that this is something that we learn more and more, and the world learns more and more about this, is that you find the talent in the most unexpected places. And I think that our kind of like understanding of what is talent and what is the process that talent needs to go through before we bring it to our company or organization or our agency is different. Because I think, and I'm a big believer still in also the formal education and people that are investing their life in research and start their career after many years of research in the academy after doing their PhD, etc. But unfortunately, this is not of course the majority. Now, I don't know if unfortunately, the reality is that the majority of talent cannot go through this very rigorous process. Plus, if there is a need for talent right now, for example, in cybersecurity, there are globally about 4 million unfilled jobs. So we can't wait 4, 5, 6, 7 years to generate this talent in the regular course of process in university and research. And that is why we need to think about attracting talent and generating talent in different ways. And we can actually, in going back to the same example I gave with the Israeli military, Unit A200 the unit I come from, which is the biggest unit in the Israeli intelligence forces, is comprised mostly of 18 to 21-year-olds coming out of high school. And it's still one of the most successful units, I don't know if in the world, but definitely in the region, okay? From a technological perspective and intelligence perspective. The talent in this unit did not go through formal university education yet. And what I'm saying here is that we need to attract talent in different stages of their career, and we need to be open to attract talent before their formal education and even without their formal education. And we need to be able also to provide them the necessary hands-on skill-based training so they can do their work. And then we'll have in our organizations, we'll have people, some of them with more formal academic, deep background, and some with more hands-on skills-based background, and they will work well together. And once people understand that it is possible, that they can, after 3-6 months or a bit less or a bit longer, they can actually start getting into this industry, then you kind of like, I'll say one more thing about this, you kind of like demystifying this concept. And, I just came from a conference right now. I'm in Israel. I came from a conference in the US, from Atlanta. It was the NICE conference, the National Initiative of Cybersecurity Education in the US. The title of the conference, the title of the entire conference, this is the big one, was Demystifying Cybersecurity. And I think we need to demystify, work in tech or in innovation or in startups. It is possible for almost everyone to make the first step into that. And we need to be open for more diversity and to open our gates to more talent coming from different backgrounds.
Thank you, Roy. And Ambassador Khani, we welcome your views about how can we attract talents to foreign service.
Well, the answer is very simple. You have to increase the pay. You increase the salary, you can attract more talented people. It's always was like that, and it still remains the same. The other element is that people have to feel that what they do is important, that there is importance to what they do. If you fail to demonstrate to people that what they do is important, they will go other places. So these are the two elements that attract talented people, because talented people have many options. I mean, Roy was talking about the young people, the 18 to 21 years old soldiers in military intelligence. There's no need to attract them because they are recruited by law. So they are not attracted, they are driven. So there's no problem there. The challenge is how to keep them in the system into the 30s. That's the challenge. And again, I think it's the same. It's in that case, it's mostly sense of purpose, and people have to feel that what they do matter and important. And beyond that, it's just higher pay. There's no other way.
Thank you, Ambassador. So the two P's, purpose and pay, right, which will play significant roles in bringing in talents. And Chairman Bilahari, your thoughts on this?
Well, for the Singapore Foreign Service, the issue is really not pay. I think we are not paid as well as in some parts of the private sector, but we are certainly paid much better than the Israeli Foreign Service, and I often feel sorry for my friends there. They are really driven by a sense of purpose.
Purpose.
I think for us, the challenge is to create a workplace that enhances a sense of purpose. And you have to start doing that by creating a workplace in which even the youngest officer, the most junior officer, believes that his bosses value his services, trust him to do what is right. I mean, he'll make mistakes from time to time. If you have a workplace where everybody is being worried about thrown under the bus, you're not going to be able to attract talent. Because in foreign service, in this kind of work, you're going to make mistakes for sure. Most of the factors in the world, if you're a small country, are not under your control. And you are working with imperfect intelligence, imperfect information. which changes. So in that kind of environment, the only way not to make a mistake is to do nothing, which is kind of fatal to a small country. But you have to create an environment where officers trust their superiors to support them, even when they make mistakes, and not throw them under the bus. I think it's as simple as that. It's not a big deal. It's easy to say, rather, but not easy to implement in practice.
So trust and empowerment to provide a nurturing environment.
Well, it's not so much nurturing in the soft and cuddly way, you know, stroke everybody, pat everybody in the head every 5 minutes and say you're doing well. You know, it can be a tough environment, but
yes.
It must be one based on trust.
Trust.
You trust your boss to do the right thing by you, and the boss trusts you to do the right thing.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from Nadia, right? It's a question about the future. Will a free trade agreement between Israel and Singapore be underway, considering collaborations between the two countries have been significantly long? This is from Nadia. And maybe Ambassador Khani, would you like to
it has to be him. I'm a pensioner and Roy is from the private sector. Only Sagi can answer this.
Okay, FTA.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get it.
Okay, Nadia asked, will a free trade agreement between Israel and Singapore be underway? Will we have a free trade agreement soon, given that we have been collaborating for a significantly long period?
Well, at the moment, there is no negotiation on an FTA. And at the moment, there is no strong demand on the part of the industry to promote such an agreement. And I think our trade relations are not suffering terribly because of the lack of such an agreement.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. And now a question for Roy. Which among Singapore and Israel has cyber laws more conducive to the innovation in cybersecurity technology? That's the first question, what intellectual give and take can happen between two countries in the field of cybersecurity laws?
It's an interesting question, and cyber laws also. I study law. I'm also a practicing lawyer. I'm not working as a lawyer today, but I did for a short time. I think in general the problem of, there are many problems with laws and regulation, but in general, the basic problem is a lot of time that it's lagging, and because the legislative process and the regulation process is long. Sometimes it takes years to make progress, while the cyberspace is moving very, very fast. So that's why you see a lot of time laws around cybersecurity, privacy, and aspects like this are lagging. So you have the problem, then the law is coming 2-3 years later, then the problem already shifted. The problem is already different. And then the law is not necessarily reflecting the problem, or the regulation is not necessarily reflecting the problem. I think that in general, if you think about cybersecurity in a broader aspect, which includes data protection, data privacy, etc., then I would say that Singapore is more, I don't know if it's more advanced, but at least more on the privacy side, I would say. I don't know if it's more advanced, but definitely it has a broader coverage of privacy and privacy laws, much more closer to the GDPR and the European approach than in Israel. Although there are privacy laws in Israel, they're just not as rigorous and not have the same coverage as the Singaporean one. So I think in data privacy and data protection, on that sense, there are more. Singapore is a bit more advanced. On the more tech side of cybersecurity protection, I think maybe Israel has some advantage there. But in general, as I said, I think that we haven't found a way to make sure that regulation is not moving in the pace of innovation, is not moving in the pace of technology. And unfortunately, this is something that we don't have a solution for that yet. Maybe somebody will come with a fast track solution for regulation, but because you need to take so many things in consideration and to consider so many different thoughts, et cetera, then I would say that both countries are still behind the reality. And maybe all countries are still behind the reality of cybersecurity and technology.
Thank you, Roy. Earlier on, Chairman Bilahari spoke about the evolving situation in the Middle East. We have a question here from one overseas participant. He asked this question about how do you see the prospects of Israeli-UAE scientific technical cooperation? What are the prospects of Israeli-UAE scientific and technical cooperation? Ambassador Khani, would you like to answer this very specific and interesting question?
Well, I mean, the Abraham Accord, as it's so called, was very important for us. That's needless to say, and opened for Israel new avenues for cooperation in the region, in the broader Middle East. And I would say a centerpiece of those accords with the agreement with the UAE, with the Emirates. And we already see scientific cooperation. We've seen several agreements signed on joint investment in technology development and research. And this goes to both industrial R&D and also academic cooperation. So these things are happening already. There is a rather substantial amount of money that is about to be invested in this cooperation. And this is, I think, not only important, of course, that's important, but it's also demonstrating to other people and countries in the greater, larger Middle East that there is much to gain by cooperating with Israel, and that I would say the majority of the Arab world is for it, and not necessarily all leaders are free to move forward. But I would say that the vast majority of young people in the Arab world are, I would say, in much favor of working with Israel on most elements. So this is happening. To answer to the question, this is happening, and we're very happy about it.
Thank you, Ambassador Khani. And related to what you just shared, we have a comment from Fazlur Rahman, who said that we have seen how the Abrahamic Accord has created some positive influence to promote mutual understanding and collaboration with some of the Arab countries. We have also seen some interfaith programs in UAE. And then he also raised about the possibility of leveraging on this technology partnership between Singapore and Israel, how it can actually include our local Singaporean Muslim community. And this can also provide a positive example to our neighboring countries. So his comment was, put aside politics, let's collaborate on technology to benefit our collective humanity, peace, and security. And looking ahead, we have a question from Bao Xuan, who referenced this growing trend of genome tech companies, how these companies have a global reach. And he asked what is Roy's brief assessment of cyber risk of these ventures, right? Of disease screening and genealogy.
So I'm happy to cover. First, there are probably better experts than me in the specific field of cybersecurity for genome tech companies. I would say my 2 cents, whatever they were. One, like every data-driven company, companies that focus on research and deep tech research are very sensitive to cybersecurity attacks because their most valuable asset is their data. And this is, I mean, for many countries, the most valuable asset is their data, but these are companies that are 100% data driven, right? Like whatever they have is the data. There are almost no other assets in these kind of companies. So, and once the data is being jeopardized, then the entire company is being jeopardized. And I think in that case, like other data-driven companies, they need to be overcautious or oversensitive about cybersecurity in all aspects. Cybersecurity is not just technology; it's technology, processes, people, and need to implement it. One thing that, again, it's not my field of expertise, but from some research I read about the topic, is that there were some, and maybe that's more an academic research at this point, although there may be industry implementations, is that I've read about aspects of actually injecting computer viruses or malware into DNA sequence. As I said, unfortunately, I am not the expert about the field, so I don't feel comfortable in talking, explaining this, right? But I think that specifically about these type of companies, you could find risks in or kind of like incorporating or encoding or bringing different type of malware that will be hidden in DNA sequences. This is something that fascinates me, but unfortunately, I'm not the expert to talk about that.
Okay, thank you. And now we have a question related to IDF, right? About how IDF is a source of many entrepreneurs. So the question is, how can SAF, what can SAF learn about nurturing this attitude among conscripts? I think Ambassador Khani spoke about sense of purpose, being bold, right? So how can we adapt this, and how can we encourage entrepreneurship among those entering the workforce in Singapore? Yeah. Ambassador
Maybe
Khani?
I'll say a word.
Roy,
Sorry.
yeah. Sure. Roy, please go ahead.
No, just one word or one sentence about this from my point of view. And I think also Bilal talk about this in the context of, I would say, allowing or giving room for failure or giving room for mistakes. And I think that's something that I've learned in the military, and that's something that at least I'm not representing the Israeli military. It's a very big organization, and I only had a small part in one intelligence unit. So I'm speaking from my specific perspective in A200 in the intelligence. But many of the entrepreneurs are coming from there, from the intelligence forces and from A200. And I think what's unique about the unit in that context is that the unit gives a lot of room for mistakes and gives a lot of room for different thoughts. And I think the concept of failing forward came from there, meaning that, the attitude of it is okay to fail, it is okay to make a mistake. You will not lose your job necessarily. The debriefing process is not about finding who to blame, but what went wrong and how we can improve it. And I think that this is something that culturally allows, because people are not worried to acknowledge their mistakes and kind of like say, I'm saying more than once every week, probably, you know what, I was wrong about this. That was a bad choice. Let's learn from it and let's change it. And I think that this is something, at least from, I don't know about IDF, again, a very big organization, from the intelligence unit and specifically the intelligence forces and specifically the A200 unit, this is something unique to the unit, that everyone has their opinion and everyone can also make mistakes, and this will be tolerated.
Thank you. So the failing forward and learning from the mistakes. And Ambassador Khani, you spoke about chutzpah and how it's difficult to adapt that quality to Singapore. Could you elaborate a little more, like are there countries that you have, or people that you've noticed overseas that have sort of used it successfully or developed that successfully?
I think I said it before. This is not something I recommend.
Not recommended.
Other people's to try to imitate. I think it's part of the culture, and there's also obviously negative elements to it. So I can only speak of what I see and what I know of my own people, but there's not something that I'm gonna give advice. I mean, try this a little bit more, and definitely not gonna give advice to the SAF over Zoom. But what I can say is that between Israel and Singapore, that goes for decades. I mean, we're very open. We are always happy to share our experiences, our thoughts, our dilemmas as well. And at the end of the day, it's up to the listeners to think what they like to take of it. That's all.
Edmund, can I say something?
Yes, please.
In Singapore, we have chutzpah. We call it being Kuailan, you know. And it's a negative aspect of that Kani Sagi talked about. So we already have it. We have to channel it in the right direction.
That is true. In fact, I was thinking about the adaptation. It's a different lingo, but at the same time, I think it's being willing to question in a constructive, hopefully in a constructive manner. So on this note, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers and our participants. Thank you very much for joining us for this very enjoyable and enriching webinar. I would like to especially also thank MEI and Dr. Alexandro and the team behind it, the Sharon and team. And lastly, this would not have been possible without Chairman Bilahari's support. So thank you so much, Chairman Bilahari, and to all of you, Ambassador Kani. Thank you for taking your leave break to join us. And thank you, Roy, for joining us from Tel Aviv too. So best wishes to everybody. And we look forward to you participating in the next MEI webinar. And on behalf of the organizers, thank you and have a great day ahead. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
The man. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Roy.